Thanks everyone for joining. I know we have about 15-20 minutes to go through this. So what we're going to do is begin with just some recap of what our team does and the digital infrastructure strategic framework, because several of you actually have been at the last two meetings at Civic Tech TO where we've presented this work, but others might not be familiar with it. So we'll just give you some background. We'll give you some updates on implementation and what we've been doing. Michelle, who's joining us today, will talk a little bit about ConnectTO and what's happening with that program, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So to move on to the recap of the Connect community team. So the Connect community team was formed in 2019, and our mission is to enable technology to improve quality of life in Toronto. So what we represent really is something different for the technology services division, which is what the IT division used to be at the city, which is transitioning more from a kind of internal focus to a more public-facing external focus as well. And so our team runs and thinks about tech policy at the city, both internally and externally as well. And what we do is you could think about our work in 4 pillars. One is the digital infrastructure strategic framework. Those are principles that guide the use of data and technology, and we'll speak in much more detail about that shortly. ConnectTO, which in one iteration has been affordable internet connectivity. At this stage, more like connecting city-owned fiber assets, and Michelle will speak about that. Policy and standards, so that's corporate technology policy and governance for the city. So things like acceptable use policy, digital accessibility standards, those kinds of things. And then advocacy and external relationships. So how do we, in engaging with regional, provincial, and other federal partners, and organizations like the city's Coalition for Digital Rights, and doing research as well. So the digital infrastructure strategic framework is a corporate strategy that we've been developing over the last few years that guides decision-making associated with digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure, I'm not going to go into a broad definition of it in detail, but at the highest level, it is any data and technology that exchanges information as part of its use. So pretty much everything is considered digital infrastructure at the city, and the DISF sets out a vision for how that technology and data can be used in Toronto. It identifies a number of strategic priorities and sets out considerations for implementing these technologies. The 6 principles of the DISF are equity and inclusion, democracy and transparency, privacy and security, digital autonomy, a well-run city, and society, economy, and the environment. And just to kind of bring us back to what we've been doing over the last few years, in December 2019, the first consultations took place, and based on those, City Council adopted the principles in January 2020. And then last year, you'll recall that we presented to Civic Tech TO in October 2021, and we did consultation throughout the fall on the draft DIP, as it was called at the time, Digital Infrastructure Plan. And then we finally submitted it to Council in March. And before that, we also had a fireside chat that Bianca hosted at Civic Tech TO, I think it was in February. And then in April, Council adopted the DISF as the guiding direction for digital infrastructure initiatives at the city. And now we're working on implementation. So this is, this was the City Council direction that was received on April 6th. It was adopted unanimously, which was a good step forward for us. But of course, we know that is it's a step forward. We have much more to do. We can move to the next slide. Hamish, did you want to speak about the implementation section now?
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
And we can hear you.
You can? Sorry, I can't. Can. Okay, great. Okay. All right. So sorry, I'm just familiarizing myself with this again. So it's the DISF that Nabeel just introduced. It's a framework. It's got multiple levels, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But in terms of its position for implementation, it's seen as a strategic framework. Above it, there's visioning and legislative policies and frameworks in place, and it's envisioned to work in conjunction with other strategic frameworks of the city. So some of those, for example, are the technology strategy, the resilience strategy, data equity strategy, and others. And below that, to operationalize the DISF, there's tactical pieces that are that either exist or need to be developed or are in process. So as an example, to operationalize it internally, we're developing a corporate policy and some of the other pieces that we'll talk about to you in a second. And below that itself are further operational adjustments that are either being created or amended to integrate the DISF into day-to-day operations. I mentioned it's a multi-layered sort of strategy. It's kind of a crazy slide, but you got the 6 principles that Nabeel talked about. They have an accompanying vision statement, so 6 vision statements follow under the principles. Each of those vision statements have accompanying strategic priorities. There's 28 in total, and those strategic priorities themselves have implementation considerations, 162 in total. So when we start to think about implementation and the work plan, we are going through a process of prioritizing those and balancing them with our workload resources, reporting timelines, and other related initiatives that are ongoing, which we're also going to talk to you about as well. And so I won't go into that in too much detail, but we can come back to it if there's questions. In terms of implementation as it relates to roles and responsibilities, so TSD on this slide is Technology Services Division. That's the division we work in. So this division and the Chief Technology Officer is responsible for oversight of the DISF and accountable for things like reporting back to Council from time to time on monitoring and implementation objectives and outcomes. But ultimately, implementation is a function of its uptake in the city, and in that sense, it's something that will be implemented almost across the board by all divisions that undertake technology or data initiatives. And in that way, it also is envisioned to complement existing governance structures and existing policy frameworks rather than supersede those. Just a quick note on timing. It's something that really sort of takes effect immediately upon that decision by City Council, acknowledging, however, the sort of lag that will take, the time it will take to implement some of that some of those structural pieces that I mentioned a couple of slides back, the policy pieces, the new policies, the new operational structures, for example. So now we're going to talk you through some examples of implementation. This is my last slide, and I'll hand it over to Alex. We've already mentioned, Michelle mentioned digital equity in his introduction, and he's going to talk a little bit more about that when he speaks. But as it relates to an existing policy, an existing internal policy, the asset management policy, which is under review, we have identified an opportunity to review the disposal component of that policy review, specifically the donation piece of it, to see how that might fit into a digital equity policy. So thinking about the digital divide and the potential opportunities to help residents connect to the internet through internet-enabled devices. So we're exploring we're exploring the role that Toronto can play in that process. So some things we're thinking about, obviously, as it relates to the DISF, privacy and security of hard drives, for example, the environment, society. Obviously, there's objectives related to equity and inclusion, so it's a really good case study, we think, for the DISF. Critically, obviously, it's something that would need to work for the community, and we need to get a better understanding of that. So we're looking to connect with potential end users later on in this year to understand their needs and to identify whether or not the donation of devices from the city would add value, or if an alternative solution would sort of fill that role. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex for now. Thanks.
Yep. So an example. Hi, I'm Alex again. He, him. An example of another piece of work includes an artificial intelligence registry. Based on some early work that the team has done, our current approach will be to model it after an AI registry that they have over in Helsinki and Amsterdam. In summary, what it is going to be is a list of various more mature AI systems that the city uses. And today we've done a canvas to all the different division heads to try to figure out what they have identified in terms of the AIs that they're using. We've gone around and we've sniffed out a couple of others that are out there. If folks are interested in more details, we do have some early prototypes and questions for feedback.
Thanks, Alex. I was going to say that, and so this slide is helpful. So another kind of piece of work that we've been focusing on over the last few months and will continue is to establish some sort of regular public engagement communication around digital infrastructure initiatives at the city. And what we want to do is provide updates of this nature regularly on implementation of the DISF. As Hamish showed that slide, there are 73 different initiatives, and some of them take 3 months, some of them will take 6 months, some of them will take more than a year because of their nature and their complexity. So we want to be providing proactively updates on what those are. We also want to get input and feedback on new digital infrastructure initiatives. And it's going to be challenging if we try to do one consultation per every initiative. So our current thinking is that we might consider doing almost like omnibus consultations, but that's something that we still haven't fully determined yet. And we want to hear from you and get your input on what the right process or format would be. The newsletter would be one way of doing this. So if you go to toronto.ca/digital-TO, there is a newsletter that you can sign up to. We currently have over 400 people that have signed up, but and we can add more. We also want to be sharing updates through social media. We want to be holding regular events and consultation, which we haven't done. So these are new processes that we're going to be launching starting this fall. We have established a First Nations Inuit and Métis Data and Technology Circle that actually Michelle and Alex were both part of helping set up. It hasn't met yet, but I think it's just in the process of getting set up. And we do want to launch a digital infrastructure public advisory body, which some of you who were part of the community advisory group for the DIP have heard about. We spoke to you about it in December last year. So now we'd like to move forward with setting that up. And I just want to take this moment before we move on to Michelle's slides to just kind of also flag that, we want to have, we plan to come back to Civic Tech TO once a quarter to provide updates, but that's by no means the only way in which we want to continue engaging the community. So, but hopefully this will be a valuable way to do that. Maybe next slide, yeah. Or Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Nabeel. So I'm here to give you a bit of an update on where Connect-TO is at this point. And Alice, I'm going to invite you to jump in at any point with your sage wisdom. One of the primary questions that is guiding the efforts of the Connect-TO team is who can benefit from the city's investments in network assets and infrastructure. And to do this, we're approaching the previous slide. the middle segment there was research, but we're approaching research in two primary buckets. One that's focused on the city's internal needs, and that includes costs and also vulnerabilities, not necessarily technical or network vulnerabilities, but vulnerabilities associated with long-term cost relationships with third-party service providers. And then, of course, the other primary bucket with research and policy development is in and around the needs of residents. Now, our immediate hands-on focus is to bring the City of Toronto up to par and up to a level that is close to some other municipalities in Canada who are much further along in their fiber journey and investments in network infrastructure for public good. So we really want to, we are playing a little bit of catch up here, but we still believe it's very good and necessary work to be done. Next slide, please. So just a snapshot of the city's fiber asset journey. In the 90s, Toronto did invest heavily in fiber network infrastructure assets through a series of unfortunate events. And I'm quoting that television series here, but we're no longer in possession, or direct possession of those assets. So where we are today is we've been directed by council to investigate opportunities for centralizing the administration and investment ongoing investment in building up the city's fiber asset inventory. So that's going to involve an internal audit, looking at what we have right now, what's in play, what that looks like for different divisions, and obviously a cost analysis as well. Looking down the road, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to really get the city up to a level with some of our municipal compatriots across the country where they're able to, leveraging the investments they've made in their network infrastructure, to deploy some pretty cool technologies in the public realm to help better the services that the city is able to offer residents. Next slide, please. So just an example, this is this graphic, we've used this in the DISF as well. Just some of the opportunities, the business case for using high capacity network infrastructure in the public realm to support and enhance and some of the city's critical services, public safety broadband networks, things like that, effective and efficient delivery of services. And when the expectation in delivering city services is that they are done efficiently, cost effectively, all those sorts of great things, but also new opportunities to monitor the condition and the status of the built environment that is the City of Toronto. And of course, as I've mentioned, the cost benefits, migrating away from a leased model to an owned model, which has been done by several municipalities across the country. And what could that look like for the City of Toronto as well? Next slide, please. So our fiber program at a glance, where we are right now, is we are currently in the process of examining and auditing our existing fiber assets. We are actively engaged in establishing technology services as a fiber asset owner within the City of Toronto. And we do have our preliminary fiber deployment areas and projects planned out for 2025. So that's a huge win for us. We will be approaching what it's been called a dig once approach, but I prefer to think of it as leveraging the city's ability to get infrastructure into the ground based on the massive amounts of capital construction that the city does every year. Anytime we open up a hole or dig up a sidewalk or a street, there's a great opportunity for us to get that conduit into the ground at economies of scale that rival, and in some cases even surpass, those of some of the dominant telecommunications service providers. In the shorter term, we're looking at some countermeasures to help alleviate digital connectivity barriers and try to redress some digital equity issues within equity deserving communities that we've identified. And in the longer term, once we have those network infrastructure assets in the ground, well, what sort of position does that now put the city in terms of being able to reach out and work with other service providers, ISPs, and things like that, potentially on an open access basis? That would be a fantastic idea. And helping those communities in need in terms of obtaining and maintaining what is de facto compulsory access to high capacity broadband in the home. Next slide, please. So here's a map of the cities, what we're looking at in terms of how fiber infrastructure currently looks in the city. So red is what we already own, and it's mostly owned by transportation in relation to the rescue camera network. The blue is where we have identified existing capital construction projects. So this would be things like water main replacement, sidewalk replacement, road rehabilitation, anywhere construction work is being done that would allow us to get the conduit into the ground. Those are the blue segments there that we've identified. In the green segments, the TBD are the gaps that would be left over that we would have to find some way to fill in if we really wanted to make a robust and serviceable network. But we are, I don't know if that slide is still in there or not. I think I may have haphazardly removed it. Yes, I did. But if you can go back to the map just for a second, if I had a pointer. So this, just the northwest quadrant of the city there, Rexdale, Weston area is where a little bit south. Yeah, there. This is where all those blue segments in there, Eglinton, Crosstown, and Lawrence Crosstown extension, that is where we have our preliminary fiber going into the ground for 2025. We're starting in that neighborhood up there. Next slide, please. And it's not just about redressing the city's internal needs. We are importantly very much concerned with communities, equity deserving communities. And so some of the programs and initiatives that we're involved in on the digital equity front, public Wi-Fi, doing lots of great work. One of our colleagues, Anita, has really been carrying the ball on this. In terms of our expanding free public Wi-Fi, we have 300 locations scheduled for completion by the end of 2024. And this would be in City of Toronto community centers, TCHC buildings. Now in the buildings, though, it would be limited to common space connectivity. And we are currently live at 4 community centers and 2 TCHC buildings. That's Wellesley Falstaff Community Center, the Powerhouse Recreation Center, and the Mimico Arena is where we're currently live. So that's lots of work being done in the free public Wi-Fi realm. Research in collaboration with Toronto Metropolitan University, the same team who helped with the Mapping the Digital Divide project of a couple of years back. We're currently working on a very exciting, personally find this incredibly exciting and incredibly robust household broadband survey. Now, this is really going to move us in the direction of being able to quantify and collect data about more broadly digital equity issues, but more specifically how households use broadband just to maintain what I call their basic and instrumental activities. So just the basic stuff, keeping the hydro on, paying the bills, ensuring your kids are able to get the most of their education, things like that. Things that many households in higher income neighborhoods just take for granted. So we're really looking at digital connectivity as essential household infrastructure. And with that, we're going to be collecting very important data that is, for the most part, missing from national data sets in and around issues of affordability and disconnectivity. How much does it actually cost in total cost, mobile, fixed, and otherwise, to keep the internet lights on in in a household? Are there issues with services being disconnected due to an inability to pay? And if so, what do households have to do to get the internet lights turned back on? These are massive gaps in both the literature and the data that's currently collected by our colleagues up at the federal level that we are really going to resolve with our household broadband survey. Number three, we've been tapped and will be participating with CC4, so this is the Cities for Digital Rights Coalition. Toronto will be looking at leading a digital equity community of practice working group. That's very exciting for us. On the intergovernmental front, because it's not just all about working within the City of Toronto, we sit at tables with municipal representatives across the GTHA on issues of digital equity, specifically lobbying, lobbying to higher levels of government. We put together an intergovernmental comment on ISED's most recent directive to the CRTC. And that was signed by all the big cities across Canada. We are actively lobbying and working with the province on amendments to things like the Provincial Planning Act, the Housing Services Act, all with a view to enhancing digital equity and connectivity, and also importantly supporting the FCM on getting them to adopt digital affordability as part of their formal lobbying platform for the first time in their history, and also importantly supporting them on the TELUS appeal, which could have dire and significant implications for municipalities if TELUS is successful at the Supreme Court. Some of the other countermeasures that we're looking at that involve more of a direct subsidy approach. We're examining the possibility of providing in-suite Wi-Fi across the TCHC seniors housing unit. And we're also looking at a household subsidy in collaboration with Computers for Success. So they're the ones who administer, it's Toby Merritt's team administers the Rogers Connecting Families program. They've got the API that does that. So looking at is there an opportunity for us to help equity deserving communities in the City of Toronto in partnership with CFS. And public assets for public good. In the process of doing our own introspective internal audit of what we have in terms of network infrastructure, how much it costs us and the public in our current relationships with service provider. Looking down the road, is there a business case that we can make for not just investing in the assets, but what do we do with it? Can we operate it on an open access basis? What are the regulatory implications? Obviously, the city would have to register as a carrier. That's not an amazing thing because there are several municipalities in Canada that already do that. And gauging interest from non-dominant service providers and ISPs in terms of how much interest is there in the market or appetite in the market to partner with the city should we have these high capacity network assets in the ground, those sorts of things. So I think that's it for me, and thank you very much.